Welcome to Stress Test. We are so excited to have you with us. We have a special guest today, as we do each and every time we get together. But Martijn van Tilborgh, co-founder of Avail, he is the expert of blowing your mind.
I don't probably think anybody's ever described him that way. He has great insight, intuition, and has a phenomenal ability to dissect and categorize things, whether it's scripture or business practices or marketing or whatever. He's a strategic marketing architect and a consultant for churches, organizations, and individuals. And he provides a lot of services, including brand development, book publishing, and marketing. He has 4 companies that he's a part of or has founded and runs: Four Rivers Media, Kudo Publishing, Dream Releaser Enterprises, and then Avail Publishing, which you already mentioned.
And Avail Journal, so many great things that are happening there. And we're going to get to hear some of those things, but greater than that is a story. You're going to love it. So lean in, block out a few distractions, and go with us on this journey of Stress Tests with Martijn van Tilborgh. Well, we are so excited to have with us Martijn van Tilborgh. Martijn, thank you so much for being with us on Stress Test today.
Thank you, Shane and Sue. It's an absolute honor to spend some time with you today.
We're looking forward to diving in here.
Yeah, I'm really excited because you always come out with a lot of profound truth that you drop. I've got my pen and my paper ready, so we'll be taking notes.
Pressure. No
No
pressure.
pressure.
Right?
Don't stress about it.
Yeah,
well, now I'm stressed.
We don't want anyone to come on Stress Test and be stressed.
No, just be yourself.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun today. Hey, give us a little update on your family and life and how things going.
You know, family is
beautiful
good.
Yard in the back and beautiful set.
You know, this is a few 100-year-old tree that was shaped like a bonsai tree by the Indians. I kid you not.
Wow.
It's one of the handful of trees like this in Sanford, Florida, where the Seminoles used to live. I think I say that right.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my daughter, Allison, who's sitting here, who's the subject matter expert.
We'll let her correct you along the way. If she wants to pipe in at any time, that's okay.
Yes, that's good. Now, everybody's good. We're getting ready for our summer trip. We're going to go, I'm going to leave tomorrow, actually, go to Alaska for 5 days with my wife and my youngest son. And then after 5 or 6 days, Allison and her husband, John, will join us in Seattle. After that, we'll take a cruise. And then when we come back, our son, Andrew, and his wife, Robin, will join us for 10 days to be in Seattle and Portland.
Nice.
So that should be very fun.
Are you cruising Alaska?
I am.
Yeah, we did that. Was it last year or the year before?
Yeah, last year. Summer.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, one of our favorite things ever.
I've been told it's good, so we're looking forward to that.
Just astronomical.
You're going to have a blast. And we're actually going to be up there in Fairbanks in September to lead a staff retreat and a men's retreat and several things that we're speaking at. It's so beautiful.
Alaska was one of those bucket list things for us. And then when we went, we're like, shoot, now we got to keep coming back here. This place is amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking.
People tell us.
Yeah.
So,
gorgeous.
You're going to love it. Well, thanks for taking some time before in between trips and in between so many things that you're doing. Martijn, you've been so successful in your media and publishing companies and Avail, but you took a really unusual route to get there. I'd love for you to take us a little bit with you on this journey of how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, so, people say that a lot. Wow, you took an unusual path to where you're at. But in my opinion, if your path is usual, you're probably not on the right path, right? Because everybody's path is unique. And making it usual implies that other people have traveled the same road. And there comes a point in your journey with God where the only person that can walk that road is you, and which makes it unusual because it deviates at some point from everybody else's path. But yeah, I was born in the Netherlands. Um, Grew up Dutch Reformed Church at a young age. I was about 8 years old. I remember watching TV. As I'm watching TV, I have an encounter with God.
Mm.
I just know in a split second, He's real, He's there, He cares
Mm.
beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's one of
Mm.
these moments that, I knew as a little boy the concept of God, but in that moment, I knew He's real. Problem
Mm.
was, I used to go to church on Sunday mornings. I grew up in a very religious Dutch Reformed church. My dad was a deacon wearing a black suit, black tie, designated seat. We only sang psalms at a certain speed. I mean, very religious environment. So there was this discrepancy between what I had experienced and what I was experiencing in church. And the only thing that I could conclude from that discrepancy was God is real. He just doesn't go to church, right?
Wow,
So that kind of put me on a path where I just had to discover things on my own because the religious system I was part of didn't give me much help. But God always brings people across your path that can help you on your path. And that happened. So by the time I was 18 years old, I decided, you know what? I believe God's calling me. And by now I'm part of a spirit-filled Pentecostal church. And in that environment, there were three options for when God calls you, right? Because when God calls you, you do one of three things. You become a pastor, you become a missionary, or you become an evangelist, traveler, itinerant minister type of person.
wow.
So
Yeah.
over the course of a decade and a half, I tried all three. I planted 5 churches at one point simultaneously while having a full-time job. That about killed me. So
Yeah.
I don't recommend this to anybody. Now, even though 20% of that season I look back at with joy, there were a lot of good things about it, but the other 80% was absolutely horrible. You talk about stress. Thankfully, I was young back in those days. I could handle it, but it was a very stressful season at the same time. So when my pastor called a meeting one day and says, "Hey, I'm going to South Africa. Who's with me?" I was the first one to raise my hand because it was my out in that situation and an opportunity to try the second thing that God may use you for when He calls you, right? Becoming a missionary. So I did that for 3 years. And through a series of events, I ended up in the United States. My wife's from America. And we decided to move to America. And I did the only thing that I hadn't tried yet, which was itinerant ministry, which I did for 2 years. That was probably the funnest of the three, looking back on it, but it still wasn't it. And it led me through different experiences, and maybe or maybe not, we can share some more of that during this interview. But it got me into a situation where I was forced to start a business because simply I had to pay the bills. And now, in hindsight, another decade and a half later, I see the hand of God in that switch where
Wow.
I thought I was being punished to now go into business, something I swore I wouldn't do. I can now clearly see that the business was the pathway to allowing God to release me in what He truly had in mind for me. So, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I don't think in terms of business and ministry anymore. It's all the same. I used to think dualistically. If God calls you for ministry, you can do business. If you do business, you can do ministry. Those are two different worlds.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, I've seen God redefine what I thought ministry was in a very radical way, creating true kingdom paradigm where everything I do is business, everything I do is ministry. It really doesn't matter. It all contributes to the advancements of God's kingdom, right? So, yeah,
We
been
should
fun.
pause on that for a moment
Go
because
ahead.
I think there's a lot of people who experience stress in their calling because of these paradigms, the boxes that have been
Yeah.
created.
Yeah.
You wrote a book called Out of the Box, right? And
Yes, unboxed.
Unboxed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. And you really get stuck, and people
Totally.
created these barriers almost And you probably went to the altar for all three of them thinking something was wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I wrote Unboxed over a weekend, literally. I sat down, my wife was out of town, and I decided, you know what, this weekend I'm going to write a book. And I wrote Unboxed. Now, it wasn't like this was a quick book I wrote, because I wrote it in my spirit for over a decade.
Right.
And it was the result of reflecting back on my journey. I had those 3 templates of ministry in mind, and I tried to conform and fit in like a square peg in a round hole, or a round hole square. I don't know how the American expression goes.
Right.
It's one or the other.
That's okay.
And it didn't fit, right? Because here I was trying to plant 5 churches the conventional way, how I was taught. This is how you plant churches. This is how you pastor. This is what it means to be a pastor. I'm always baffled to look at churches, to look at pastors, and aside from denominational, theological, doctrinal differences, essentially we all do the same thing, right? We show up on a Sunday morning and we talk for 40 minutes between 2 hymns, and we take up an offering, and that's the Sunday morning experience. But then for the rest, being a pastor comes with 27 other responsibilities that are just part of the job, because somebody at some point decided that that's your job description if you're going to be a pastor. But the reality is, again, we're all unique. We all have a different grace. We all have a different gift upon our lives. Like, there is no such thing as a job description for ministry, because the expression for each individual is going to be so different. So how come that we all seem to produce the same thing when we say we're in ministry? It's because the structure, the template we create is exactly created to output that same thing. And it keeps us from what I believe, what Paul says, displaying the manifold wisdom of God that is diverse. And we kind of create this one-size-fits-all model, and we label it pastor, and we stick individuals in Saul's armor and say, this is now how you're going to kill the giant, and somehow it doesn't work. It causes stress, and you can't put your finger on it. You think you're doing something wrong, and in fact, you are doing something wrong, because I call it third-party projected responsibilities. There's a system or a culture that projects to you, this is how you do the job. And I felt a lot of that in that journey when I was a pastor, when I was a missionary, when I was an itinerant speaker, that this is how you do it. And somebody wrote a song about that, right? This is how you do it. Montel Williams. Fun fact, Montel, he's a good friend. I consulted with him a couple of years back.
Wow.
And, it's like growing up with that song, and now I'm sitting and saying, Montel.
Let's sing it together. No,
this is how we do it.
Take it.
So I was going to say, moving to a country then adds a whole other dimension to not fitting in the box, right? So you're also changing cultures, and you're operating in another location, trying to start from scratch, which a lot of ministers start from scratch. And there's an entrepreneurial aspect to pastoring that maybe is expected, or not everybody has it, like you said. But can you speak to maybe some stressful turning points that helped you move towards your calling during that period where you were starting over here?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's well put. So, the saying goes, diamonds are created under pressure. So I do think that there's a reality that everybody has to go through these seasons where stress is the norm, with the purpose of God pushing you into your unique individual purpose. So I don't think stress has to be bad if it pushes you the right direction.
That's good.
I also think that, it's just kind of like an organic, natural course correction dynamic that God puts in place to keep you on the path. There's this scripture about, going to the right, going to the left, and you'll hear a voice behind you saying, this is the path. And it's like, on the left side of the path and the right side of the path, the more you deviate from that middle line that God has in mind from you, the stress level goes up and it allows you to hear that voice behind you. But I remember waking up in South Africa. My wife was already awake, and she's like, "Man, Holy Spirit woke me up, telling me to check on your green card status." And I had applied for a green card years prior. Took me 3 years to get it. This was right after 9/11. She went online, found out about a rule that if I don't set foot in America, one day out of the year, I'm going to lose my status. You know, when I went to my final interview, that would have been a nice thing to say. Like, you know, nobody bothered to tell us this. They knew we lived in South Africa as missionaries. So now, a year minus 3 days later, she wakes up and finds out, hey, in 3 days, your thing's going to expire unless you jump on a plane and get your butt back there. Truth was, it was exactly 365 days. But because we flew in for a final interview to Orlando, Florida, for a 5-minute interview,
The time zone.
we left, jumped on a plane, flew back. They processed the paperwork 3 days later, stamped it off after we had already left. So the stamp on the documents, I think it was like June 26th, but we had left June 23rd.
Yeah.
So technically I had breached it, but it wasn't documented that way. So I had like 3 days of gray area that I might come back. And it was one of these moments where things, I call them prophetic context clues, where God does these random things in your life and they don't make sense and you can't see the picture. But now you're forced because you're forced to think about something. You're forced to go there in your mind. And you say, God, what are you doing? And it opens this door for him to put the puzzle together. And it became crystal clear to me that he wanted us in the United States. And one of the things that he said in that 3-day window was, I'm about to reawaken the United States of America, but my church ain't ready. And before I do anything, there's always a voice that precedes what I'm about to do. And I want you to be part of that voice. I want you to be a voice of the church. Don't get a big head. You're not the only one. There's 7,000 others like in the guys of Liar.
Right.
And so that became so crystal clear to me in that 3-day window. But well, long story short, I arrived with our family 3 days later with the only belongings that we had left from past season in suitcases. Man. And to your point, Sue, we started from scratch. Like, what in the world were we going to do? I call it my Finding Nemo experience. I may have shared this with you before.
Yeah.
But the listeners might not have heard me say this. It's like this vacuum that was created. And if you've seen the movie, if you've not seen the movie, first of all, shame on you. It's
Stop
one of the best.
right now. Push pause.
Like,
go watch it.
Push pause, watch the movie, come back. But there's this plot line of the fish in the aquarium, dentist office. They want to get out. They don't know how. They try this, they try that. Nothing works. And then at the end of the movie, they finally figured it out. They clog up the filter. The thing turns green. Now the cleaner guy comes, put them in little bags. And the whole idea was when the guy puts us in bags, we roll out the windowsill and we drop in the city harbor and we're free. And they succeed. They roll out of the windowsill into the harbor, and they're celebrating as they float in these little bags in the harbor of Sydney.
The bags.
And then it gets awkwardly silent, and they look at each other, and one of the fish says, "Now what?" And it's like, in some ways, their life in the little bag floating in freedom was worse than being in that little aquarium, right? And I started realizing when we landed in America, we set foot on US soil, that we look at each other like, what are we going to do with our lives? Like, we thought in that 3-day window, oh, God is calling us. We're going to take the land. We're going to be a voice to the church, like higher. But then how do you do that? And I started realizing that up until that moment, people provided us with what I call, or what I defined in hindsight as templates of ministry. What I mean by that is, you show up on Sunday morning, you preach. You show up on Tuesday night to do Bible study. You show up on Wednesday night to small group. You have a day off on Thursday, maybe. Then on Friday, there's worship night. In other words, corporate from a ministry point of view, dictates to you, this is the schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And you show up to perform those tasks within the schedule, which is what creates what I call a false sense of religious accomplishment. So now I'm going through the motions of doing the work of the ministry, making myself feel good about everything I'm accomplishing, while in reality, am I really moving the kingdom needle?
Right.
And I had to make a decision when we had that now what moment. Am I going to find another ministry that's going to put me to work and stick me into their template, which is the easy thing to do? Or am I just going to chart through the wilderness and figure out how to give birth to something unique that's only given to me, that nobody else can do because God gave it to me to accomplish? And that's the latter is the choice that we made. It's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Comes again with stress. But again, the moment you deviate from that path, there's always that voice that course corrects. And the more you correct that course in line with what God has in mind, is where the stress gets removed. But the moment of making that shift, moving from South Africa to America in a 3-day window, that was the easy part. That came with excitement because it was in
Right.
Yeah,
line.
there's adrenaline with that.
That wasn't good. It was once we got here.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the pressure was like, oh crap, now what?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
And you did such an amazing job. I explained it earlier, just like you've blown up some boxes for us today, and for some people listening, for ministry paradigms, but also within those ministries and what you're doing and calling, what your calling is, and how you live that out, and how stressful that was for you along the way. There had to have been some turning points, right? When you're living a lane that nobody's carved out before, you are cutting a new path. Tell us about some of those moments. Were there some moments that you said, man, we've got to do something different. We've got to make a change, or this is going to kill us?
Yeah, like every morning when I wake up, you mean?
Yeah, like every morning.
Yeah, no, totally. And again, there's different reasons why that pressure increases. I spoke about, this third-party projected responsibility that causes that stress. Like, man, I know it doesn't feel good, but I gotta defeat the giant this way.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also like what I call self-inflicted perceived responsibility. And that's responsibility that you tell yourself you should be responsible for, while God's not asking you for that. Interesting story. I got 2 interesting stories if we have time. But in this whole season where we were planning churches, like parallel tracks, like 4 or 5 churches at the same time,
Right.
I think about that now. I'm like, what in the world was I thinking? Like, but in the moment, I thought, I'm doing the Lord's work. This is it. I was born to do this. And I remember at some point when I took the time to be quiet and actually listen, it was like God was saying, like, so tell me about what you're up to. I'm like, what do you mean what you're up to? I'm like planting churches. And he's like, tell me about that. What is this church planting thing? I was like, what do you mean? What is this church planting thing? He's well, you talk about this church planning thing. Like, what is? We go to a city, we gather some people, we sing some songs, we worship you, and I am like explaining to God what church planning is. And he's like, well, never heard of this thing called church planning, but good luck with it. And it made me realize, like, I'm doing something, first of all, he didn't ask me to do. Second of all, there was no biblical, and if God told you to plant church, by all means, keep doing it. But I started to realize that I could suddenly not find any scriptural reference to the activity of church planting, which became very liberating thought to me. Like, oh, so I can actually be in ministry and not do this. Maybe God is bigger than church. First of all, Jesus built his church. We were called to preach the gospel of the kingdom, right?
Right.
We're called to a
And
relationship.
we
Yeah.
just translate that to a certain activity that looks a certain way.
Mhm.
And I put the pressure on myself to do that. He never asked me. But even in pastoral roles like your own, so many pastors are stressed out of their mind, and I talk to them almost every day. The pastoral phone calls they get and the need of the congregation.
Mhm.
In my own way, I've experienced the same thing. Alison, my daughter, and I were just talking about it today as we were reflecting on the situation. But I remember this kind of crazy story. We were in Italy, in Sicily, and I had somebody working for me that moved in from another country. And he had made this move for the company and all that. And somehow something in me told me I had to buy a house. And I had to buy a house quickly so he could live somewhere. He didn't ask me that, right? I just felt responsible. God didn't ask me that. And I remember laying in the pool at the hotel, texting with my real estate agent, putting out bids on a property that I knew was available in the neighborhood I was trying to buy a house.
Wow.
Made the deal, the contract. A few days later, I'm in Prague. I'm dealing with the paperwork. So now I'm spending the whole day on my vacation, dealing with financial statements and submitting this and submitting that. And for those who know me, that's not my thing, right? Like I cannot do paperwork. It's like so stressful for me. So after that, doing that for a whole day, I remember we had booked as a family activity an escape room in the city of Prague. We're walking there, and I was stressed out of my mind like I have never been. I've been sitting in weird positions, doing emails, and I remember having this like little twitch, like in my heart area, and I freak out. I go into a straight panic attack. I know I'm having a heart attack, at least I think I know. I'm losing it. And the only way I can respond to that moment is I can only think of running. Now, I'm wearing boots, jeans, leather jacket, and I'm like, I gotta control my heart rate somehow in a certain rhythm. And I start city center of Prague. I kid you not. I start running. I can't stop for an hour. Circles. My family's like, what in the world's going on? I said, I think this is it. I think this is the big one. I got to call the ambulance. And an hour long. And so I remember my son Andrew, he starts following me because my wife's like, you go run with your dad. I don't know what the heck he's doing, but run with him.
Yeah.
And I'm running, he's following me, starts running in tongues, and he starts praying over me as I'm losing my crap, right?
Right.
And meanwhile, ambulance comes, and these two doctors, and suddenly I can't stand still, right? So I have to run. Suddenly I come to the point where I'm somewhat still, but I'm still like twitching in front of this ambulance. These guys like, yeah, you're having a panic attack, nothing to do with your heart. We can take you to the hospital, but it's gonna cost you. But just, go back to your hotel, you'll be fine. But the root was I put pressure on myself to do something nobody asked me to do. And I remember it took me a few months to recover from that whole incident. And we still refer to the Prague incident frequently, like, "Hey, Dad, don't start running," when they see me get stressed. But I had to make a 9-hour flight back home a few days later. I remember going to the Amsterdam airport and like, I'm not gonna make that 9-hour flight in a little chair. Like, what if I have to run in the airplane? Like, it's not gonna happen.
I don't think they
And
allow
I
that.
kid you not, and this is, me being very raw, 9 a.m. airport Amsterdam. First thing I did, I find the first open bar, knock to 2 Chardonnays. Yeah, to take off the edge to get me calm enough to board that plane.
Wow.
But that's where, these things can escalate. First of all, if you don't recognize what causes it, deal with the root of it. And so there you have it. There's a
Wow.
story for you.
What a turning point. And sometimes it takes those kinds of arrested moments, a little bit crazy running around a parking lot, but to realize I've got to make a change.
Yeah.
And lead us through some of the lessons that probably have keep coming, but that was a turning point. And now after that, forward from Prague on, lead us through some of
Yeah.
the lessons that you've been
Yeah.
learning.
So
managing
I've
your
broken it down for myself into 4 types of stress, or 4 causes of stress.
Right.
And it's like, when there's a storm in your life, what kind of storm is it?
stress.
There was a storm
Mm-hmm.
that came to Elijah on the mountain to refine him. There was a storm in the life of the disciples that they just had to speak to and calm it, right? And then there's a storm that comes through disobedience, Jonah. Like, what is the cause? What's the root cause of the symptom?
Right.
Discerning that is where it starts. For me, I found 4 categories of that stress. We covered already 2, like the third party projected responsibility, trying to follow a template that's not God's, and taking on responsibility that's not yours.
Mm-hmm.
And then this self-inflicted thing that I just described, you make yourself
Mm-hmm.
responsible for something that nobody's asking you to do. Maybe certain people do, but you don't own these people to do that.
Yeah.
And then there's misaligned responsibility. Like, that happens when you get an autopilot, you get comfortable. You start following
Mm-hmm.
patterns of what used to work in the past, thinking it will continue to work. And slowly but surely, 3 years later, you've drifted from your core purpose and assignment. That has happened a few times. Or what used to be your assignment is shifting, and your grace is shifting, and you're not paying attention, and now you're misaligned, and that causes stress again. So how do you realign yourself? But then there is simply pure responsibility that's being asked for you, which
Mm-hmm.
causes a healthy form of stress that actually can fuel you into God's purpose. And I think it's important to realize too, like, sometimes God is just giving you the stress it's like pulling you back and shooting the arrow. And that's the best kind of stress that I think everybody should experience from time to time to get deeper into God's plan and purpose. Yeah.
I'm curious now because of these 4 things I wrote down. Where would you put sin? Like when maybe we're on autopilot and we move towards bad coping mechanisms or poor judgment, or we get in some sort of a coping response to stress and thereby create a whole whirlwind of trauma, like the Jonah incident, right? He could have obeyed, but he was afraid. And so he made a logical choice to go the other direction. Where would you put that? Is that already on this list, or is that something else?
Sure. Yeah, that's on your list. I mean, I recommend not doing sin. So,
or you don't sin, so you don't have to categorize it.
No, but that's a cause of stress. The wages of sin is death. So you're going to produce death through your life as opposed to life through your life. Like, you don't manifest the kingdom, you manifest death. You got to course correct, but there's still consequences to that. And there's a ripple effect. It's like you smoke for 30 years because you're stressed on your mind, and now you got stage 4 lung cancer. Like, I don't know what to tell you, bro.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
You kind of paved the way to it.
Yeah, unless God heals you supernaturally, which I'm sure he can do if he's willing to. There's not much I can help you with. I mean, I still recommend stopping after 30 years, but there's just certain things. There's definitely consequences, and if you don't halt that pattern, it can escalate really, really fast. It will snowball. Yeah.
Well, that's a good recommendation. Stop sinning.
For example, I mean, I just heard that in a sermon once, and
yeah,
I didn't come up with that.
It's really practical advice, but we redefine what sinning actually is. Like, for instance, your self-inflicted pain. Like, when we take on responsibilities that's not ours, we're not obeying God. We don't think in terms of that we're sinning. We think that we're helping God, or we're doing something good for the ministry, but we can turn off the wrong way. And God, in a sense, that's disobedience, because that's not what God's asking us to do.
Well, exactly. And that's, what's the definition of sin? You ask 100 people, you get 100 different opinions. But in my definition of sin, it's missing the mark
Right.
of why you're alive.
Mm.
And any of these things, other than healthy responsibility, in some way makes you miss the mark. Therefore, you're sinning. I know what you mean by sin when you say, like, hey, somebody goes through a divorce and start using drugs to cope with the pain, and now that creates that spiral that doesn't make things better, and it causes all kind of stress because of all these situations that you're creating. I get that, but that at the core of the meaning of that word, it's like, if you're not living a life of purpose, Jesus said, for this reason I was made manifest. He knew exactly why he was here. And unless we can say that same sentence, for this reason I was made manifest to blank, unless somebody can say that with confidence because they heard God tell them this is who you are, I think there's always a channel of stress open that pushes you more in alignment with what that is supposed to be, if that makes any sense.
I love that. I love that. And I think, you are, as you're laying these lessons out, I'm thinking, boy, you're leading multiple businesses and you're really traveling all over the world, and you're talking to pastors and leaders every day. Talk to us about, what do you see and how do you see us avoiding some of this stress?
Yeah.
And not taking on, that self-inflicted call, the third party projection, or misaligned. How do you see that carving out
I
the path?
think unless we can put definition to what we're sensing and discern the underlying reason, it's almost impossible to deal with. It's like recognizing the problem, not the symptom. What's the underlying reason for what I'm experiencing? Getting clarity with that. And I'm hoping what I'm sharing today helps at least some people identify and put language to what it is they're experiencing, because that's where it starts. So now you can just say, look at your life, evaluate it, and like, okay, what is the underlying reason? What category can I put it in? Because now I know what to change. So if Jonah isn't going to, the right guys down the road, then clearly the answer is to turn around and go there. But if you don't know, it's just something wrong with the world you live in.
Right.
It's very hard to cope with stress in a healthy way. Yeah.
Love that. I think a lot of pastors and leaders need to hear how to avoid this, how to manage their stress differently, especially as we talk about concerning the future. And Martijn, you talk a lot about the future, the kingdom of heaven, and you're great at blowing up paradigms. Okay.
Well,
blow up our stress paradigm today. Okay. Blow it up a little bit. And how do you
I don't know
see us?
if I'll blow it up,
church?
but my conclusion has been lately that wherever you are in life, you cannot avoid stress. It's always going to be there in some form. Doesn't have to be bad if it fuels you to get better and deeper into God's purposes. What do I mean by that? I was reflecting on this exact point just a couple of weeks ago, and I decided to write an article about it in Avail. It's coming out imminently. It's at the printer right now.
Awesome.
But I talk about whether you live in Egypt, and I'm figuratively speaking, whether you live in Egypt. When you live in Egypt, life's stressful, right? Not just for you, but anybody, any generations that raised you, like 400 years of stress. And it didn't get any better. In fact, it became worse the closer they got to the end there. They got to work their butts off. They didn't have enough to make ends meet. Life was pretty horrible in Egypt. So then they thought, the answer is to escape Egypt. And then they did through a series of events. Their leader came, his name was Moses, took him out through a process and protocol and how that was supposed to happen. Got a little resistance, but it ended up working. God delivered them. You'd think stress is over, right? Couple of chapters in, these guys want to go back.
Yeah.
Because how are they going to eat? At least we got leeks, onions over there. How are we going to eat? And then God does a couple of miracles. He provides water and some birds and some manna from heaven, and they just I just want to go back to Egypt. Somehow the stress of the past was more appealing than the stress of the present, even though in reality they had moved to a better place, closer to the ultimate purpose of God. But it doesn't end there. Then 40 years later, they arrive at the threshold of their fulfillment of destiny and purpose. You think that once they cross over that Jordan, they come to a place of peace and rest and, non-stressful. Well, the first time they tried, they were stressed before they even answered because the 10 spies, we know that whole story. They said, you know what? Better to stay in the wilderness than to cross that Jordan. They had to learn their lesson the hard way. They died in the wilderness. Then that younger generation shows up. And then 2.5 of the 12 tribes, they decide in the spot, never mind.
We'll stay here.
We'll stay here.
Yeah.
What's up with that, right? And I used to think, looking at the guys that had made it in ministry of business, and they drove the fancy car, and they had the big organization and the budgets, and they had their act together. Once we get there, life's going to be easy, as if it doesn't require the same faith as the wilderness or Egypt. And but here were 2.5 tribes that suddenly start preferring the wilderness over the promise. Like, how does that work? So now that I'm considered, and I have by no means arrived, one of these guys I used to look up to, and I'm experiencing some of that success, and I realize that the promised land actually requires more faith than the wilderness, because the wilderness was hard at the beginning, but by the time the wilderness season was over, it's pretty predictable, actually. God always came through. I wake up, there's going to be manna. And what was stressful those first 2 weeks in the wilderness kind of became your comfort zone. Like, they'll work out, there'll be food. And now there's like this predictability your everyday life. Now you're crossing the Jordan, and the strategy that it takes to take the first city, that same strategy kicks your butt the next city. And you got to stay alert. And now you're responsible to come up with revelation and insight and strategy to make that next move. And I started realizing that, I started understanding those 2.5 tribes. Like, there comes a point where you look at the USPS guy delivering mail, and nothing wrong with that job, but that becomes very appealing to you suddenly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because, that promised land is not as stress-free as you think it is. But it's the payoff of that stress and navigating that is, I think, as long as we can keep seeing that, because that's where we start changing the world. That's where we're going to start seeing transformation in the world around us. That's where we're going to expand that Garden of Eden that God has given us to expand. And keeping that in perspective, keeping that in front of you, it helps you understand, like, there is stress in the promised land. There's giants to kill. Like, what were we thinking? And it's almost like Egypt was the least stressed part.
Right.
But you couldn't see that until you got there. And so I hope that offers some perspective to some people that are, at the point where they want to throw in the towel. But we got to keep in mind the payoff of of walking in purpose and walking in destiny and causing transformation, kingdom transformation in the sphere of influence that we've been given,
Right.
because that's invaluable. Like that's why what we do it for, right? So for whatever it's worth, there you have it.
That's awesome.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean, the future is always more fearful than the past. Even if the past was horrible, at least you know it
Yeah.
because you've got hindsight. But
I love that picture. You're talking about how, you know, that present stress versus the past stress. And it made me think of Jesus saying, no one who puts their hand to the plow and looks back
right.
is worthy of the kingdom, because
Yeah.
the kingdom is always moving forward, isn't it? It's always
Yes.
moving forward.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no point, because the past and the past never going to come back. So they're never going to, in that sense, catch up with you. But the other dynamic is you have selective memory of the past,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a whole psychology about that.
Yeah.
Where you remember the highs of
Right.
certain things,
Right.
and you start thinking that the past was actually so much better than your present. And oftentimes it's not, but that's what our mind tricks us into telling. That's why these guys was, why did we leave Egypt? Well, may I remind you, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't seem to remember some of those things. And no, Egypt's not a good place to be. Wilderness is not a good place to be.
Right.
And even though the promised land is very, very hard, requires a lot of faith and courage, and dealing with stress, it's worth the journey. And yeah, at least that's what I keep telling myself.
Yeah. It's a good message.
Well, that's really profound when you think about it. The Bible uses Egypt as a metaphor for the past that you don't go back to. You know, when Isaiah says, behold, I'm doing a new thing. People want to, like, I think when you're afraid, you want to go back and do things the way they were done before, because it feels familiar, it feels safe. And even if you did that, it's not the same, because everything has changed and you've moved from the past to the present. So, we see that in ministry all the time, trying to recreate things or bring things back because they make us feel comfortable, and it's going to be different anyway.
Yeah. If we truly believe that God's kingdom is ever increasing, right? I like to believe personally that God's kingdom is expanding at the speed of light. Doesn't say that in scripture, but I like to believe that, because look at the universe, like it's expanding. Like that's all part of his domain. So our context of time and space shifts every second.
Yeah.
And therefore, who we are in that context needs to be adjusted to that ever expanding and ever changing context. That's why we can't repeat the past, because it won't work the same way. And not even time and space, because that's just a fact. Like this second, a second ago, will never come back, and God's kingdom is so much bigger now than 3 seconds ago, right? But even our worldview, our perspective. I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. Think about those times when Moses wrote scripture down. The worldview he had, like he didn't know the United States existed.
Right.
Just the mere fact of globalization and understanding our context so much better today. And any kind of revelation needs to be interpreted in context of the bigger picture for it to be valuable to us today. So how do we calibrate the interpretation of the revelation in our current context? Because that needs to continue almost on a daily basis. That's why I believe David had guys on his team, a couple of hundred of them, sons of Issachar, that understood the time and the season and could interpret their purpose and their assignment in context of those times and seasons. And
that's
supportive.
so cool. I love the beauty that you present here today, and you represent Isaiah prophetic perception to me. When Isaiah said, God is doing a new thing, can you not perceive it?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I love the way you're always embracing, Martijn. Every time we speak with you,
Mhm.
you are embracing and striving for perceiving what God is doing, forgetting the former things, reaching for those,
Mhm.
I just
What
love
is he
that.
doing next?
Love that.
Yeah. And it's not easy, not for me either. I know that's like my message.
Mm.
But even right now, going through a season where I got trapped in my own thing that I said nobody should do, I'm doing it. And I'm just
Mm.
going on autopilot. And I come to realization, hey, what got us to where we are can get us to where I'm going.
Mhm.
And what do I need to realign? What do I need to change? What, you know, and it's a good thing.
Mhm.
It's a good thing. That's that voice behind you that say, hey, buddy, a little to the right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the good
Yeah.
stress. It's the friction that's
It's
creating
really good.
something, moving you forward rather than paralyzing you. Yeah.
Well, I think these lessons keep perpetuating,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's not like you taught us these 4 lessons and we can move on, or you gave us these 3 perceptions of different
Yeah.
wilderness. You continually are walking through them, right?
Yeah. It never ends.
Love
Yeah.
it.
There's no end to the increase of his government of peace.
Mm.
And it's just there's no end to it.
That's
Yes.
awesome.
So,
Well,
yeah.
Thank
I
you
hope
so much.
I hope you will come back with us again and
I would love to.
continue to teach these. But you mentioned Avail. I'd love to let our listeners know,
Yeah.
how can they get that article you were talking about, but also just the Avail Journal, which has been such a great resource to us.
Mhm.
We've loved your books, but we've really loved Avail Journal.
Yeah. Yeah. Veil Journal is really a leadership journal for the faith market that I believe adds a lot of value. Availjournal.com. It's like an offer where you can get a free trial subscription to Avail. Availjournal.com will send you that, no strings attached, and you can experience for yourself what kind of value that it brings. But the next issue that comes out, that's at the printer right now, if you sign up now, you're probably not going to get that issue, but the next one. However, when you go to theartofleadership.com, we always post our digital edition, and in the next couple of weeks, I'm sure it will be up, and you can just download the whole digital file, and you'll find it in there. It's called "Longing for the Wilderness." It's the
Mm.
title of the
Mm.
article,
Oh, I
which
love
you
that.
really shouldn't do, but I was
Mhm.
doing it lately, and then I started
Mhm.
seeing what I just
Mhm.
shared.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for blowing up some paradigms for us today and blowing up some boxes and leading the way in the kingdom of heaven for so many leaders. Love it. And your transparency today.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always good.
Thank you for
Well,
sharing your
thank you.
story.
I'm truly honored that you would even invite me to be on here. It's always good to talk to you guys, and
Yeah, you too.
being on a podcast with some real big names.
Were there
It's
someone?
humbling.
I don't know who you were talking about today.
Yeah, he's talking about Mark and yeah.
We've got some you followed our friend Sam Chand, and
Oh yeah.
he did promise
Your friend.
to be back here on here. So your friend
Well,
is
keep
gonna come
keep the
back to
man keep the man
Yeah.
accountable to what he
He
said.
promised to
That's
be a
right.
backup, so we're
Yeah.
gonna hold him to it.
Well,
Yeah.
Martijn, you've been great. Hey, how do we connect with you personally on socials as well?
Yeah. So I have a funny name, right? Martijn van Tilborgh. Like, how do you even spell that? It's like
Yeah,
Martin
right.
with a J,
Martin with a J.
Martijn. Van, separate word. Tilborgh, Tilborgh. Go to the socials, type that in, you'll find me. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'll connect. Ask me a question, I'll answer.
Love it.
And always good to, yeah,
You know,
find new friends.
when they search that, there's not a lot of Martijn van Tilborgh
No,
that are going to
Perfect.
come
no,
up. But that
there's a
fits.
few.
That's so fitting for you in the unique path that you lead and have led us through today. So, hey, thank you so much for being with us. We have a little different way of ending our podcast, where we love to pray for people, and whether they're business leaders or church leaders. Hopefully, you would take a moment right now, wherever you're listening or driving. Hopefully, don't do that. But wherever you're at, take a moment right now. Pray with us for Martijn as we lead you in that. So, Martijn, would that be okay if we prayed for you?
Absolutely. I take anything I can get.
Awesome. Well, let's pray for
Yeah.
you. God, thank you so much for the insight that you've given Martijn to give to us, that pass along. God, we don't have to live by anyone else's calling other than the one you have for us, the unique path you have for us. Thank you for Martijn and the vision you've given him. God, I pray your blessing that you would complete the work that you've started in him all around the world. Bless Avail Journal and every single issue in every hand that it falls. We pray, oh God, would be a blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, was that as good as you thought it was going to be?
Oh, better. Martijn is always amazing.
Yeah, he's always dropping truth bombs all the time. So his first statement right out of the gates, everyone's path is unique. There's no usual path. I thought that was a great representation of who he is and what he does, but also a good setup for figuring out the root causes of our stress. And I think the biggest one, I don't know if it's for everybody, but the biggest one to me is that self-inflicted perspective. I think that's always what gets in the way of our calling, is we try to step into a role that's been created for us, or that we create for ourselves. We think, I have to do it this way. I know we didn't even talk about this, but as women in ministry, there are huge hurdles in this area, that there are certain things women are allowed to do, not allowed to do. And if you're gifted that way and you want to do it, then people think you're bossy or you're pushy or you're, you know what I mean? Anyway, I loved what he said about self-inflicted parameters and perspectives, and we can very easily get off track, get derailed, and develop massive insecurities and anxiety because we're trying to be somebody that God didn't create us to be.
Oh, that was so good. And for me, the paradigms that he gave us, he's the paradigm buster, man. I told you. I told you at the beginning. Martijn has that amazing ability, but I loved it thinking through my own future and thinking through maybe you're trying to process your own leadership right now and looking through the lens of the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. So Egypt, the lens there, then wilderness, then promised land. Every single stage, aren't we always looking at someone else's and comparing our callings, comparing our seasons? And worse than anything, I think, is when we compare our present with our past. And so I know I get stuck in that. Everyone can get stuck in that. But breaking out of that and realizing, hey, God is calling me forward. The kingdom of heaven always moves forward. I'm so challenged today. And I was challenged today. I know I mentioned it, but the Isaiah prophecy was just like ringing in my head and my heart. And maybe that's a good way for us to go out today. That God's doing a new thing right now. He's doing a new thing. Can you perceive it? What's stopping you right now? What's stressful?
Why can't you perceive it?
Projection from somebody else, a third-party projection, self-inflicted calling. How can we break out of that? Yeah, and Martijn's great book.
This is the last book that he's written, Unleashed, which talks about this exact thing, is stepping into your calling and feeling the freedom that God wants you to feel so that you can do what God called you to do. It's good. I've highlighted it.
There you go.
As I do. That's a good mark of
She doesn't
a good
read
book.
she doesn't read without a highlighter. I listen to books, so I can't do that.
If I'm not highlighting, then there's not a lot to say, but I highlighted.
So do it what's best for you. But we thank you so much for joining us for this time on Stress Test. And as always, we'd love to go with you on the journey. So listen to it on any of your favorite streaming platforms. Subscribe and like our page on YouTube, and so you don't miss an episode. Find us on socials. We'd love to go along with you on your journey.
Thank you. Bye.